It's 3:47 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and you're scrolling through your phone, half watching a video, half thinking about what to make for dinner. The hum of your refrigerator blends into the background noise of modern life, so constant you've stopped noticing it years ago. Traffic lights outside your window cycle through their eternal pattern of red, yellow, green. Somewhere in a hospital across town, a ventilator breathes for a patient who can't breathe on their own. In a data center hundreds of miles away, servers process billions of transactions per second, the invisible infrastructure holding together the digital world. And then, in a single instant that no one sees coming and no one can explain, it all stops. Not a power outage, not a blackout, but something far more absolute. Every electron that was flowing through every wire, every circuit, every device on Earth simply ceases to move. The fundamental force that allows electricity to exist hasn't disappeared, but something has changed in the universe that makes it impossible for electrical current to flow through conductors anymore. Your phone screen goes black mid-sentence. The hum of the refrigerator cuts off so abruptly that the silence feels like a physical presence. Every light in every building, in every city, across the entire planet extinguishes simultaneously. The traffic lights go dark. The ventilator stops breathing. The servers crash into permanent silence. In the span of a single heartbeat, human civilization loses the one technology that every other technology depends on, and nothing will ever be the same again. This is where our story begins. In the first seconds after the end of the electrical age, as 7 billion people simultaneously realize that something has gone terribly, impossibly wrong. The immediate chaos would be unlike anything humanity has ever experienced, because electricity is so deeply woven into every aspect of modern existence that we've forgotten how to function without it. Think about what you're doing right this second. You're watching this video on a device that requires electricity. The device connected to the internet through routers and cell towers that require electricity. The video was uploaded to servers that require electricity. The building you're in is probably lit by electrical lights, heated or cooled by electrical systems, secured by electrical locks. If you're in a car, the engine management system is electrical. If you're on a plane, everything from navigation to life support is electrical. Remove electricity, and almost nothing in the modern world continues to function. But the failure wouldn't be gradual or manageable. It would be instantaneous and universal, which means there's no time to prepare, no warning systems, no backup plans, because all the warning systems and backup plans also require electricity. Let's start with the most immediate casualties, the people who are alive right now, only because electrical devices are keeping them alive. Millions of people in hospitals worldwide are connected to machines that monitor their hearts, help them breathe, filter their blood, regulate their medications. The instant electricity stops, these machines stop, and patients begin dying within minutes. There's no manual backup for most of this equipment, no way to hand crank a dialysis machine or operate a ventilator by candlelight. Hospital staff would be plunged into darkness, trying to save lives using nothing but their training and whatever mechanical tools they can find. But for many patients, there simply wouldn't be enough time. The death toll in the first hour would be staggering, measured in hundreds of thousands globally, maybe millions. People who were stable and safe one moment and coding the next. Their lives ended by the absence of a technology that had become as essential as oxygen. But the hospitals would be overwhelmed almost immediately by a different crisis: the cascade of accidents triggered by the simultaneous failure of every electrical system on Earth. Imagine every traffic light in every city going dark at the same moment during rush hour, every electronic brake system, every automatic transmission, every power steering mechanism in modern cars suddenly failing. Planes in flight would lose all their electrical systems instantly, their instruments going dark, their fly-by-wire controls ceasing to respond, 30,000 feet of altitude being the only buffer between them and catastrophe as pilots attempt to glide unpowered aircraft toward emergency landings using nothing but mechanical flight surfaces and whatever training they can remember about pre-electrical aviation. Most would make it down, but not all. The skies would be marked by contrails that end in sudden descents, by aircraft that become gliders racing against physics and luck to reach any flat surface before gravity wins. Trains would lose power mid-journey, some coasting to gradual stops, others derailing as electrical switching systems fail and trains continue onto tracks that were supposed to be empty. Subways would become tombs of darkness, hundreds of people trapped underground in tunnels without light, without ventilation, without any way to know if help is coming, or if they're simply going to suffocate in the dark as oxygen slowly depletes. Elevators would freeze between floors, trapping office workers and apartment residents in small metal boxes, some for hours, some for days, if rescue is delayed by the overwhelming scope of the catastrophe. The death toll from accidents alone in the first 24 hours would dwarf most natural disasters in human history, simply because electrical failure would cause every modern safety system to fail simultaneously. But here's what makes this scenario uniquely catastrophic compared to something like an earthquake or a hurricane. There's no outside help coming. Natural disasters are localized, which means unaffected regions can send aid, supplies, rescue workers. But this is global and absolute. There's no functioning government to coordinate response because governments require electrical communication systems. There's no way to call for help because phones don't work. There's no way to even know what's happening beyond your immediate line of sight because all information systems have collapsed. Every person on Earth would be isolated to whatever they can see and hear directly, forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and growing panic. The social fabric that holds civilization together requires communication, and communication over any distance greater than shouting range requires electricity. Remove that, and you don't have a civilization anymore. You have 7 billion isolated individuals and small groups, each trying to survive without any coordination or shared understanding of what's happened or what to do next. Within hours, the reality of the situation would become impossible to ignore. The sun sets, and there are no street lights, no building lights, no lights at all except fire. Cities that are visible from space as brilliant networks of illumination would vanish into absolute darkness, broken only by scattered fires, some intentional as people try to create light and heat, others accidental as the chaos of the first day leads to uncontrolled burning. But fire without electrical pumps to move water means firefighting becomes impossible at scale. Buildings burn until they run out of fuel, or until the fire spreads to another building, and another entire city blocks consumed because there's no way to stop it. Los Angeles, New York, London, Tokyo, cities that have existed for centuries suddenly vulnerable to destruction by fire in a way they haven't been since the pre-industrial era. And then there's water, something so fundamental we rarely think about it, except that in modern cities, water doesn't flow by gravity alone. It's pumped electrically from reservoirs to treatment plants, treated using electrical systems, then pumped again through distribution networks to reach buildings, especially tall buildings where water pressure alone can't push water up 40 or 60 or 100 floors. Turn off the electricity, and most urban water systems fail within hours as the pressure drops and the pipes empty. People in apartments turn on taps and get nothing, or get whatever residual water remained in the pipes, enough for maybe one more toilet flush, one more glass to drink, and then nothing. 7 billion people, most of them living in cities, suddenly without access to clean running water. There are no emergency water deliveries coming because the trucks that would deliver water can't function. And even if they could, there's no way to coordinate delivery or communicate where water is needed most. Starvation would follow within days in cities, because cities are fundamentally unsustainable without constant imports of food from agricultural regions. The modern city is a marvel of logistics, food flowing in continuously from farms hundreds or thousands of miles away, distributed through supply chains so complex and electrical dependent that they collapse entirely without power. Grocery stores in cities typically carry maybe 3 days' worth of food for their local population, operating on just-in-time delivery principles that minimize waste and storage costs, but create no buffer for disruption. Within 72 hours, city grocery stores would be empty, looted by desperate people, or simply depleted by normal shopping, before people realized the resupply trucks weren't coming. And the trucks aren't coming because modern trucks are electrical systems on wheels, their engines controlled by computers, their fuel pumped by electrical pumps, their routes planned by GPS that no longer functions. Even older mechanical trucks that might theoretically run without electronics face an impossible problem. The fuel stations they'd need to refuel use electrical pumps to get gasoline from underground tanks. There's fuel in the ground, millions of gallons of it in stations across every country, but no way to pump it out without electricity. The psychological impact would be as devastating as the physical crisis. Human beings are adapted to handle emergencies that are temporary, situations where you endure hardship, knowing that normalcy will return eventually. But this isn't temporary. There's no indication that electricity is coming back, no timeline for restoration, no authority figure explaining what happened or what the plan is to fix it. The silence from governments and media, the complete absence of information, would be more terrifying than any official announcement could be. People would create their own explanations, conspiracy theories, and supernatural interpretations filling the vacuum left by the collapse of scientific communication. Some would believe it's a military attack, an electromagnetic pulse weapon deployed by an enemy nation. Others would interpret it as divine judgment, the end times, punishment for humanity's sins. Neither explanation helps anyone survive, but humans can't tolerate not understanding, so they'll grasp at any narrative that makes the chaos feel meaningful or explicable. Within a week, cities would become unlivable. The combination of no water, no food, no sanitation, and no information creating conditions that drive mass exodus. Millions of people would begin walking away from urban centers, heading toward rural areas where they imagine food and water must be more accessible, where they picture farms and wells and a simpler lifestyle that doesn't depend on electricity. They'd be partially right. Rural areas would fare better than cities, but not well enough to absorb millions of urban refugees. Every road leading out of major cities would become a river of humanity, families carrying whatever food and water they could scrounge, walking toward a destination most of them have never seen, guided by nothing more than instinct and hope. The highways would be clogged with abandoned cars, dead metal obstacles that refugees would have to navigate around. Each vehicle a tomb of the electrical age, useless without the technology that animated it. But here's the cruel irony. Even in rural areas, modern farming is so dependent on electricity that food production would collapse almost immediately. Industrial agriculture uses electrical irrigation systems, electrical sorting and processing equipment, electrical refrigeration to store harvests, electrical vehicles to transport produce to market. A modern farm is a factory that happens to grow living things. And like any factory, it stops functioning without power. Farmers would be able to harvest whatever crops are currently ready. But without refrigeration or transportation, most of that food would rot where it sits. Animals would fare differently depending on how they're raised. Cattle in fields with access to grass and water could survive, becoming humanity's most valuable resource. But pigs and chickens raised in electrical confinement operations would die by the millions, either starving in their cages or being slaughtered by farmers who know the animals can't be sustained and would rather process them for meat while it's still possible, even though without refrigeration, the meat will spoil within days. The collapse of food production would trigger famine on a scale unprecedented in human history. Currently, Earth produces enough food to feed roughly 8 billion people, but only because of industrial agriculture that depends entirely on electrical technology. Remove electricity, and global food production drops to maybe 10% of current levels. Only what can be grown and harvested using human and animal labor with hand tools. 10% of current production supporting 100% of current population means 90% of humanity faces starvation. The math is brutal and unavoidable. Some regions would suffer more than others. Places like Singapore or Japan that import most of their food would see catastrophic famine within weeks, while places with more arable land and lower population density like parts of Africa or South America might survive better, but nowhere would be spared entirely. The death toll from starvation in the first year would be measured in billions, not millions, the single greatest catastrophe in human history, worse than all wars and diseases combined, and caused not by malice or nature, but by the sudden absence of a technology we'd become so dependent on that we forgot how to live without it. Violence would become endemic as desperate people compete for dwindling resources. The social contract that keeps humans cooperating rather than killing each other depends on the belief that cooperation benefits everyone more than violence does. But that belief collapses when resources become so scarce that cooperation can't produce enough to keep everyone alive. In a world where there's food for 10% of the population, 90% are facing death regardless of how cooperative they are, which means the incentive shifts toward taking resources from others by force. Communities would fragment into smaller and smaller groups, each defending whatever food and water they control against outsiders. Neighbors turning against neighbors as trust evaporates and survival becomes the only priority that matters. The weapons used would be primitive by modern standards. Guns would still work, but ammunition would be finite and irreplaceable. So violence would increasingly rely on knives, clubs, bows, whatever can be made or maintained without industrial supply chains. Human history would regress 1,000 years in the span of months, not gradually, but catastrophically, as every institution and social structure built on electrical civilization collapses simultaneously. Medicine would return to the 19th century overnight, or perhaps worse, because at least 19th century doctors were trained for a world without electricity, whereas modern doctors have no experience with pre-electrical medicine and no access to the texts and knowledge that guided earlier physicians. Antibiotics would still exist in warehouses and pharmacies, but without refrigeration, most would degrade rapidly, and production of new antibiotics would be impossible without electrical pharmaceutical manufacturing. Surgery would become agonizingly dangerous, performed without electrical lights, without monitoring equipment, without reliable anesthesia for procedures that require more than the limited supply of chemical anesthetics that exist. Mortality rates for childbirth, infections, injuries, all the medical conditions we've learned to treat effectively, would spike to levels not seen since before the germ theory of disease. Average life expectancy would plummet from roughly 75 years globally to maybe 35 or 40, and that's only for people who survive the initial famine and violence. Children and elderly would be especially vulnerable, their survival rates dropping precipitously as medicine loses its ability to compensate for weakness or age. Knowledge preservation would become one of humanity's greatest challenges, because most of human knowledge now exists in electrical formats, stored on hard drives and servers and cloud systems that are completely inaccessible without electricity. Libraries still exist with physical books, and those would become invaluable beyond measure. But most technical knowledge, scientific research, medical information, engineering specifications, all the detailed documentation of how modern civilization works, exists only in digital form. Universities and major libraries would become fortresses, defended by people who understand that the books inside represent humanity's only chance of rebuilding. But many libraries would be destroyed in the chaos of the first months, their books burned for heat by people who don't understand what they're destroying or don't care, because immediate survival matters more than abstract future rebuilding. The loss of knowledge would be staggering, entire fields of study vanishing because the experts die, and the information they carried in their minds or stored in computers becomes unrecoverable. But humans are remarkably resilient, and after the initial die-off, the survivors would begin adapting to their new reality. Small communities would form around whatever resources exist: farms with arable land and water sources, forests with game and timber, rivers with fish and transportation potential. These communities would rediscover skills that had become obsolete: how to preserve food without refrigeration using salt and smoke and fermentation, how to make clothing from raw materials, how to build shelter using hand tools, how to navigate without GPS using stars and landmarks. The survivors would be selected not for intelligence or moral worth, but for location and luck. People who happened to be near resources when everything collapsed. People who had skills or knowledge relevant to pre-electrical survival. People who got lucky in the initial chaos and avoided the violence and disease that killed so many others. These survivors would become the seed population for whatever civilization emerges from the ruins, and their values, skills, and stories would shape human culture for generations to come. Technology would rebuild slowly, painfully slowly, because electricity itself hasn't become impossible. Only electrical current flowing through conductors has stopped for some inexplicable reason related to the fundamental structure of the universe. Humans would eventually discover that the problem has limits or exceptions. Maybe electricity works in certain conditions or certain materials. Maybe the universe's rules have changed in ways that make some electrical systems possible while others remain impossible. Scientists among the survivors would experiment, trying to understand what changed and whether any workarounds exist. They'd rediscover that magnetism still works, that chemical reactions still work, that mechanical energy still works, and they'd search desperately for ways to harness these forces to recreate some shadow of the electrical civilization that was lost. Maybe they discover that organic electricity, the kind that flows through neurons and muscles, still functions normally, leading to bizarre bioelectrical hybrid technologies where living organisms are incorporated into machines. Or maybe they learn to work within whatever new physical laws govern their universe, developing technologies we can't even imagine that accomplish similar goals through completely different mechanisms. But the rebuilding would take centuries, maybe millennia, and it would occur on a planet dramatically transformed by the collapse. Cities would remain as ruins, massive concrete and steel monuments to a vanished age, slowly being reclaimed by nature as vegetation grows through streets and buildings collapse from neglect. Future generations would explore these ruins with awe and incomprehension, unable to fully grasp what the strange artifacts they find were for or how they functioned. A smartphone would be an incomprehensible mystery, a smooth rectangle of glass and metal with no obvious purpose. Its true function lost along with the knowledge of electricity and digital technology. The ruins would be quarried for materials, steel and copper, and aluminum harvested and repurposed for simpler technologies, but slowly because pre-electrical metallurgy is labor-intensive and dangerous. The population would stabilize at whatever level the planet can support with pre-industrial agriculture, probably somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion people globally, living in smaller communities, practicing subsistence farming, supplemented by hunting and gathering, their lives dominated by physical labor and immediate survival needs in ways that would be familiar to humans from 1,000 years ago. Culture would change in profound ways, shaped by the trauma of the collapse and the need to ensure such dependence never develops again. Stories about the electrical age would take on mythological qualities, tales of a time when humans could speak across vast distances instantly, when they could fly through the air in metal birds, when they could light the night as bright as day with the flip of a switch. These stories would be dismissed by some as exaggerations or fantasies, while others would revere them as accounts of a golden age that was lost through human hubris or divine punishment. Religion would likely experience a resurgence because the complete failure of scientific civilization would be interpreted by many as evidence that the materialist worldview was wrong, that there are forces beyond human understanding or control, that dependence on technology was a mistake that led humanity away from more important spiritual truths. Whether this religious revival would be beneficial or harmful depends on which values it emphasizes. Communities built around compassion and cooperation would thrive, while those built around rigid dogma and punishment would create unnecessary suffering. But either way, the secular scientific culture of the electrical age would be largely displaced by worldviews that emphasize tradition, faith, and acceptance of limits. And somewhere in the distant future, perhaps 500 years after the collapse, a new civilization would be taking its first tentative steps toward industrialization again, but this time with the haunting knowledge of what was lost and the determination not to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors. They would have access to the physical books that survived, fragmentary and often confusing accounts of electrical technology written for people who already understood the basics, and they would try to decode these texts to understand the principles their ancestors mastered. Maybe they would discover that whatever changed in the universe has changed back, that electricity flows again through conductors the way it once did, and they would approach this rediscovered power with caution and reverence, remembering the stories of how completely civilization collapsed when it disappeared. Or maybe electricity remains impossible, and they develop a completely different technological path, one based on mechanics and chemistry and biology rather than electronics, creating a civilization that looks nothing like ours but serves similar functions, meeting human needs for communication and transportation and comfort through technologies we never imagined because we took the electrical path and never looked back. The question at the heart of this thought experiment isn't really about electricity disappearing, because that's physically implausible to the point of impossibility. The real question is about fragility, about how completely modern civilization depends on technologies we don't fully understand and can't easily replace, about what happens when the systems we trust completely fail catastrophically. We live in a world where a moderately powerful solar storm could damage electrical infrastructure on a massive scale, where a coordinated cyber attack could shut down power grids across entire continents, where infrastructure, neglect, and aging systems create ever-increasing risks of cascading failures. The scenario we've explored, the instantaneous and universal loss of all electrical technology, is extreme and unlikely, but the underlying vulnerability is real. Our civilization is built on foundations that are more fragile than we like to admit, dependencies so deep that we've forgotten their dependencies at all. We've mistaken the tools we use for the reality they help us navigate. And in forgetting that distinction, we've created a civilization that's extraordinarily powerful and productive when everything works, but extraordinarily vulnerable to systemic failure when something breaks in ways we didn't anticipate. So we return to that moment at 3:47 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. You scrolling through your phone, the refrigerator humming, the traffic lights cycling, life continuing in its familiar electrical rhythm. But now, you're aware of how thin the line is between normal and catastrophe, how much of what seems permanent and reliable is actually contingent on technologies continuing to function as expected. The lights stay on, the phone keeps working, the water keeps flowing, not because these things are inevitable or natural, but because vast systems of human knowledge and infrastructure are operating correctly, because engineers and technicians and planners are doing their jobs, because the physical laws of the universe continue to permit the flow of electrons through conductors the way they always have. Take any of those things away, and the whole structure comes tumbling down faster than anyone wants to believe. The comfort you feel right now, the security, the sense that civilization is solid and stable, all of it rests on the unspoken assumption that the technologies we depend on will continue working tomorrow the way they work today. And maybe they will. Probably they will. But understanding how much we've bet on that assumption, how little we could do if it turned out to be wrong, that understanding changes something fundamental about how we see the world. The lights are on, for now, and that simple fact, that continued glow of electrical civilization all around us, is not a given or a right, but a gift, temporary and precious, and more fragile than the darkness it holds at bay.